Before we begin, first I'll introduce myself. Most of you already know me, but for those of you who are visiting us for the very first time, I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, the director of ISSI. And I want to make a couple of announcements before we get to the introduction of our speaker today. First, on Tuesday, March 10th, Chris Cepeda Milan, assistant professor of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, will give a talk on, quote, perceptions of threat, demographic diversity, and the framing of illegality, explaining non-participation in New York's 2006 immigrant protests, close quote. The talk will be from 4 to 5:30 p.m. here in Alumni Hall. Secondly, I'd like to announce that the Graduate Fellows Program, sponsored by ISSI, Center for Research on Social Change, will host an application workshop on Thursday, February 26th from 4 to 5:30 p.m. in the Duster Conference Room at ISSI. Applications for this program are due by Monday, March 9th at 5 p.m. You can find more information and download an application from the Center for Research on Social Change's website. And our speaker today is an alum of that program, so I highly encourage those of you who are interested in the program to attend this meeting. As I always remind you, as I need to remind myself, I'm going to ask all of you to check your cell phones and make sure that they are turned off. And secondly, if you have not signed the sign-up sheet in the back to get credit for your participation today, please do so. Now, as you all know, the format, which I explained, is that our speaker will present for 45 minutes, roughly at 5 o'clock, and upon finishing, it will be opened up to questions and answers from all of you, and I, as I normally do, will be responsible for establishing the queue for the speaker to answer. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Gerardo Sandoval, who is Assistant Professor of Planning, Public Policy, and Management, as well as Associate Director of the Center for Latina, and Latin American Studies at the University of Oregon. We here are especially pleased to invite Professor Sandoval back to UC Berkeley. Not only did he earn his MA and PhD in City and Regional Planning from UCB, but he was a participant in our very own ISSI Graduate Fellows Program. Professor Sandoval's research focuses on the roles of immigrants in community regeneration, the responses of governments to the presence of immigrants, and the ways that transnational relationships shape the spaces that immigrants inhabit. He has published articles in various journals, which include Community Development, the Journal of Urbanism, Society and Natural Resources, Urban Studies, Local Environment, Ethnicities, and the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. His book, titled Immigrants and the Revitalization of Los Angeles, Development and Change in MacArthur Park, received honorable mention for from the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning's 2013 Paul Davidoff Book Award. The title of today's talk is Shadow Transnationalism, Cross-Border Networks, and Planning Challenges in Transnational Unauthorized Immigrant Communities. Please join me in welcoming back Professor Sandoval.
So it really is an honor to be back here at UC Berkeley. It's always good to come down from Oregon and get a little bit of sun. So I think that's always a very pleasurable experience. So yes, I'm an urban planner by training. So I focus a lot on kind of the spatial elements. But within that, I really kind of focus on kind of two themes. The first theme is understanding how immigrant communities kind of go about revitalizing their communities. how they rely on various forms of social and cultural capital to basically put pressure on planners and politicians to improve their communities. And within that inquiry, I'm also very interested in transnational issues. Okay, so this article is really based on that and on understanding the transnational connections that exist between kind of sending and receiving communities in the United States. So my first academic job was at Iowa State University. So I was there for 2 years. That's really where I got interested in this community that I started to study. The community is Postville. And you might have heard of Postville. It's a very small town of about 2,000 people, but there have been 4 books written on Postville, 2 films on Postville, and at least I know of 1 article. This is my article on Postville. It's a very well-known small town because it was the site of one of the largest immigration raids in U.S. history. Okay, so in 2008, ICE deported about 400 workers from Postville. Okay, and most of these workers were from Guatemala. And what I've done is I've gone to Guatemala and I've kind of interviewed about 50 of the workers that were deported to really it's to understand how they were building how the Guatemalan community was building a sense of place and a sense of community in Postville, and how that community was then broken, and how those transnational ties were severed because of the immigration rate. Okay. And I actually uncovered these issues when I first visited Postville. Kind of informally, I was at a small bakery there, and I spoke to a gentleman, the baker. His name was Walter, and when I was trying to buy some champurradas there, he described to me where the immigrants were from, and it turns out that they were from a town near the town where I grew up in Antigua, and so I really got interested in that way. But I've taken a very inductive approach to understanding the kind of the key issues that have happened in Postville. And at the end of the day, this story is really about unauthorized immigration. It's really about how unauthorized immigrants now play a very structural kind of role in our economic system. Okay, and I've studied this case study with that in mind, where I'm trying to understand the transnational mechanisms that exist or existed in this community, because I believe that there's a lot of other communities in the U.S. That also have a lot of these types of mechanisms within them. Out of this inductive type of research, I'm arguing that there's these international transnational networks that I call Shadow Transnationalism. So these are these kind of underground kind of hidden mechanisms that exist within undocumented communities that not only tie them back to their sending communities, but also help them gain entry and also establish a sense of community in their receiving communities. But at the same time, since this is a form of kind of criminalization by the state, it's a very vulnerable and unstable kind of relationship. Okay, so I'm going to describe to you, what I mean by shadow transnationalism, kind of the key kind of literature that I'm trying to contribute towards, and then we'll get into the case. So in this article, I focused on the networks. Yeah, I've written other articles where I've focused more on the Guatemalan community in Postville. I've written another article where I focus more on the sending communities, and this one really focuses on those transnational links that exist there. So I'll talk about the recruitment networks that existed in Postville, about the smuggling networks that existed also in Postville, and the remittance networks, and how all these networks work to transform a kind of a homogeneous Midwestern town into into a shadow place. So this is literature within the transnational field of transnationalism from below. Okay? And this is literature that was introduced by Michael Peter Smith and Luis Guarnizo, who were at UC Davis. And they were looking at transnationalism not only as kind of corporate entities kind of being linked internationally, but really trying to understand how these transnational links also worked from the ground up. Okay, so from communities that were marginalized, and how these transnational relationships actually provided them with a sense of agency and a sense of power. So Maurer argues that transnationalism from below generates multiple counter-hegemonic powers among non-elites, that is grounded in the daily lives and social relations of immigrants within these transnational social fields. And within the transnational literature, my colleague at the U of O, Lynn Stephen, kind of describes it as immigrants living transnational lives. Kind of the new literature looks at transnational, translocal kind of placemaking. But really the point is that even though these immigrants might be marginalized, that they still maintain the very strong connections back to the sending community, that they're able to use these connections to mobilize capital and mobilize, politically mobilize to gain some resources here in the receiving communities. The other literature that I used to understand what was happening in Postville was these Danish actually academics who have this concept called shadow places, and these are places where there's a lot of unauthorized communities and places that have like the conditions that help them kind of perpetuate their sense of place in these areas. So they break them down into three kind of categories. So there's the transnational social networks. So that's what I was focusing on more, is understanding that. These are areas that provide social capital that give immigrants opportunity to mobilize resources, okay, in terms of financing and work and housing, information, and getting sometimes counterfeit documents and so forth from their ethnic and family networks. Okay, the right labor conditions, and if you look at these meatpacking communities, and you put that in quotes, right? Because it's really these labor conditions where many times immigrants are being exploited, but there has to be kind of opportunities and demand for these populations within these communities, and also housing. Okay. So cheap and accessible housing, where the housing market caters specifically to unauthorized workers. And the key point here is that with little regulation, okay, so where people can pay in cash for, and where there's really no lease and so forth. Okay, so when I found this body of literature, I was really drawn into it because I was really trying to understand how to ground these transnational links within the planning field. And what these people were doing is they were trying to describe how these places are kind of get how these relationships get materialized in localities. The other kind of literature I used to help me understand what was happening here is this literature on how the notion of the shadows is used as a metaphor. Okay, so Chavez, he's at Irvine. He's an anthropologist who has done a lot of work around this invisible underclass that exists around undocumented immigration. Alejandro Portes was studying this in the 70s, okay, about undocumented workers and their condition. But then I kind of found DiGenova's work really fascinating because he made the link that I kind of needed to into the planning field, not just the spatial aspects in terms of the housing and so forth, but really in terms of how the state intervenes in these within these populations, and how the state actually provides the means to create illegality. Okay, so he argues that the everyday experiences of unauthorized immigrants are outcomes of the state's racialization and production of illegality. And then there's this other literature that focuses on invisibility, okay, and how undocumented immigrants are relegated, or even sometimes themselves they place themselves under this veil of invisibility to protect themselves. Okay, so I was working within the within the transnationalism from below kind of literature, understanding how that's grounded in a sense of place through the shadow places, and then the role that the state actually plays in criminalizing this population to create this vulnerability. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll define what I mean by shadow transnationalism, and then we'll get into the case study. And then I'll kind of bring it back to the concept, because, like I mentioned, I took a very inductive approach to doing this research, and I think now that I've have this concept to kind of work with, I can start applying this concept to other communities, such as communities in Oregon that I am now studying. So by shadow transnationalism, I mean the relations that transcend the territorially bounded jurisdiction of the nation state and link together unauthorized immigrant societies of origin and settlement within the socioeconomic structures intended to remain informal and actually and plausibly under the radar and invisible. And that's kind of key to this, is that this informality in a way is used by by different community members, as we'll see in Postville, as a way to actually protect themselves from basically for getting in trouble after the immigration raid happened. Okay, shadow transnationalism represents the underbelly of immigrant communities, where the most marginal and vulnerable groups, unauthorized immigrant populations, engage in networks and practices under a veil of intentional invisibility. Intentional on the part of the workers, employers, and the state, which criminalizes this labor force. So the global networks that sustain these shadow mechanisms include highly exploitative transnational networks of recruitment, remittances, smuggling, and lending networks that link the sending and receiving communities. So these shadow networks serve critical functions and are a structural part of global networks in the transnational social field. So my argument here is that these networks exist in many unauthorized communities, and that the state kind of perpetuates this type of criminality and vulnerability. Okay, so this is how shadow transnationalism kind of played itself out in Postville. Okay, and so I'll present this diagram, and then we'll go through the case study, and then I'll revisit the diagram once I kind of tell you the stories in the neighborhood. So you'll see here to the left, here we have Rosario. So that was the sending community in Guatemala. Okay, and Postville was the receiving community in Iowa. And we're going to look at the recruitment networks, the smuggling networks, and the remittance networks that form this kind of complex system that changed that community. Within the recruitment networks, we'll see how the churches played a key role in perpetuating even recruitment and also the smuggling that occurred in the community. The coyotes played a role. The meatpacking plant played a role. Within the lending networks, there was prestamistas and prestadores, which are money lenders. Okay, informal money lenders from the community themselves, but also formal banks played a key role in perpetuating this as well. Okay, so people were able to get loans from formal banks to finance their trip. And then we'll talk about the remittance networks and the impacts that remittances have had in the community. but before we get into all that, it's important to discuss the restructuring of the meatpacking industry, okay, that has occurred there. This is the map of Iowa, okay? So for those of you not familiar with Iowa, the Mississippi River is right on the east of Iowa, okay? Postville is right here on the northeastern part of the state, okay? It's a small meatpacking community. Now, what's driving the transformation of Iowa, the ethnic transformation of Iowa, is the meatpacking industry. Okay, so, and the restructuring of the meatpacking industry occurred in the mid '80s to the mid '90s. Meatpacking jobs used to be unionized jobs, and that changed. Meatpacking companies started relying more on Latino labor, and now more and more on undocumented labor. And they start recruiting, like you'll see in Postville, they actually recruited in the sending community in Guatemala. This is actually a picture not from Postville, but from one of my other cases inside a meatpacking plant, and it just shows like the different countries of origin of some of the workers. So some of these meatpacking plants are very multicultural. The Postville one is actually the first. It was mostly made up of Mexican workers. That transitioned to the Guatemalan workers because the owners of the plant felt that the Guatemalan workers would complain less, and they felt that they were very harder workers. Basically, complained less and worked longer hours and so forth. I've written another article on that as well, on the kind of the changing kind of racialization that occurred in these meatpacking plants, and going from and how the Guatemalan immigrants kind of became Latinos through this process of migrating and working in the meatpacking plant, and then the competition between the Guatemalan workers and the Mexican workers. Now, when you're dealing with undocumented populations, kind of counting them or trying to come up with some sort of metrics to demonstrate that they're there is pretty difficult to do. But one key way of kind of understanding, the changes is through looking through schools. Okay, and this is the Latino student enrollment in the Postville School District. So here you'll see that there was pretty much no Latino kids in the mid 1990s, but once you get into the mid 2000s, there was this really like exponential growth in there, and then you actually see like the drop in Latino youth right when the raid hit. Okay, and then I stopped. Data only goes to 2011. That's where that's kind of where my fieldwork ended. But this is just one kind of indicator of the kinds of ethnic changes that were happening in Postville. This map is just kind of showing you where some of these transnational connections were from. So depending on some of the meatpacking plants, they actually, and the networks that exist within the meatpacking plants, those communities will come from different areas in Mexico. So I was studying these three communities. I was studying Perry, Iowa, I was studying Marshalltown, and I was studying Postville. So a lot of the immigrants from Perry actually came from the state of Michoacan, and from Marshalltown, they actually came from a small town called Villachuato. So when you go to Marshalltown, you see a lot of the Latino businesses there that are catering to the sending communities from Villachuato. And in Postville, most of them came from El Rosario. Okay, so the method is, I was really taking a very, like I said, inductive approach when I did this research. And I was doing a very in-depth, qualitative case study approach. That's usually what I do for all of my research projects. And I did what Ben Flansburgh calls a paradigmatic case study. So this is a case study that helps develop a metaphor or establish a school for the domain that the case concerns. So I was very much interested in undocumented workers and on these kind of shadow connections that existed in the community. So I thought that Postville would be a really good example of that. But I think it doesn't end there. I think you can understand these relationships in other different communities throughout the United States and in other countries. I visited Postville about 11 times, and I spent 5 weeks in Rosario. So this wasn't like an ethnographic case. It was more of an in-depth qualitative case study. Interviewed about 11 informal. I interviewed about 55 in-depth interviews. So this included people in like planning positions, and local politicians, community leaders, both formal and informal community leaders, people involved in the housing industry. Interviewed. That was in Postville. Some residents that were involved in a lot of these issues in Guatemala. I interviewed mostly the workers that were detained in the immigration rate. I also interviewed people that did not immigrate to Postville. So that was actually pretty fascinating. Like if I wanted to pursue this, I could do something around that as well, and understanding kind of the differences that migration creates in these sending communities. Between those people that actually immigrated to the U.S. and those that stayed, and it creates a lot of inequality between them. And then my research question, it kind of kept changing. Okay, as I developed the theory, the question kind of emerged from that as well. And I finally ended up with this question. So how were the mechanisms of shadow transnationalism sustained in both the sending and receiving towns? So I was really interested in these transnational links. And then what were the risks and interdependencies and vulnerabilities that existed among these shadow transnational networks? Okay. So Postville, like I said, it's a town of 2,000 people. But actually, when the Guatemalan community was at its peak, there was about 800 Guatemalans there. So really, it's more like 3,000 people. But the official census figures are about 2,000. You'll notice the motto, hometown to the world, okay, because the community was actually trying to be very accommodating to the multicultural milieu that was starting in the town. Okay, and I think that's part of when I call this the building of a shadow place. I remember one time when I was doing the field work, I was standing in the middle of Postville, and I was thinking, wow, if this town is actually, you would think that there's not really much going on here. If you're just here, it's a town that has one stop light, but it's really like if you look underneath the surface, there's all this fascinating things happening, okay, around these issues of illegality and labor exploitation and these different cultures trying to figure out how to get along in this type of environment. And the first thing I'll talk about are the demand of the labor from the meatpacking community. Okay, this is, I think, the key kind of aspect that brought the immigrants to Postville. Okay, so the demand at the meatpacking plant for low-wage labor, easily accessible housing, and the linked transnational social capital. Okay, so basically the shadow places, okay, that existed there. Okay, so it brought Postville more steadily toward becoming a shadow town in the heart of the Midwest. A shadow place that was ripe with the conditions necessary to sustain a large number of unauthorized immigrants. And I think that's the beauty of studying a small town like this, because you can really, start to understand these transnational networks because of the small scale of the area. So this is from a Postville town planner. Okay, so she's talking about why the plant was so important to the community. So she's saying we benefit from the meatpacking plant, of course, via property taxes, and they bring people to Postville. Okay, so you've got people moving here that are employed at the plant or drawing from outside the region, bringing people into your town to shop. So that's an asset the city benefits from with local tax dollars and housing. If you look at the housing industry in Postville, it was really sustained by the immigrant workers. Okay? You had immigrants there that were that lived in like a 2-bedroom house, and maybe you had 5 families living in that community. So they were actually paying quite a bit for rent. Okay, so and then the housing was actually the key owners of a lot of the housing are actually family members of the owners of the meatpacking plant. Okay, so you could look at Postville as a company town as well. Okay, and actually the owners of the meatpacking plant, they had built some housing for the workers as well. Okay, I think that's really where when you make a connection to, how is this relevant to urban planning? You look at kind of the housing issues and the dependence that these small meatpacking communities have on these meatpacking plants. Okay, the recruitment networks. This is from a former meatpacking plant worker. He states that the Guatemalans came and it started as a few and then grew and grew. People would say, my uncle's coming because he needs work, and my brother's coming, and my sister-in-law's coming. And it was all word of mouth more than anything. People joked that there was a big sign in Guatemala that said Postville this way. Okay, the networks were really important. Not only the networks, but the resources that the networks played in establishing basically a welcoming community for undocumented workers in Postville. Okay, so when a worker in Rosario was ready to immigrate, they could. They actually had their housing kind of ready already. They had a job waiting for them. They had housing waiting for them, and they had their social networks waiting for them. And actually, churches played a very important role in this system as well. Okay, a lot of those informal networks started in these evangelical churches that were in Rosario, and then they materialized there in Postville. In fact, there were 3 evangelical churches in Rosario that then sprung up in Postville, and then after the raid, they went back to Guatemala. So in a way, the church kind of got deported as well. Okay, so what I have heard is that agriprocessors started advertising in Guatemala about the jobs in Postville. So one of the ladies from the Guatemala brought a copy of an article that was published in a Guatemala newspaper, and it said, if you want to work, make good money, then come to Postville. Agriprocessors, the meatpacking plant, is hiring hard workers in Postville. So the meatpacking plant really kind of took a very active role in recruiting these workers, because they were ultimately, at the end of the day, they were very good workers for them. Okay, and this is kind of interesting because I interviewed many of what I call like the diversity champions in Postville. So these were community leaders in Postville that wanted to create this welcoming environment for immigrants in the small town. And I've actually written another article where I make the argument that a lot of the literature around welcoming immigrants and immigrant adaptations kind of falls apart if you don't consider these shadow networks that exist in these communities. Okay, so as I stated, the town government really saw them as a resource, okay, that contributed to the local tax base, that also saw them as entrepreneurs in revitalizing Mainstreet. In fact, in a lot of my work, I first start doing research on these small communities by looking at Latino small businesses and their contributions to redeveloping their cities, and then I get into more, I think, a little bit more interesting kinds of things. But there was about 4 Guatemalan stores, 2 Guatemalan restaurants in town. There was just this little immigrant kind of milieu being built in the community that was catering to the Guatemalans in this town. Residents also organized the annual Taste of Postville. So this was a cultural celebration where it drew people from throughout the region around celebrating kind of culture and food and so forth. The Catholic Church served as a very important institution in accommodating immigrants in the town. They had, masses in Spanish, different programs that helped immigrants adapt to the town. They even have a multicultural station, okay, Radio Postville. So broadcast in English, Spanish, and Hebrew. And actually, I should mention that the meatpacking plant was a kosher meatpacking plant. Okay? And there's a book written by Stephen Bloom called The Clash of Cultures, and that's on that conflict, okay, on the Hasidic Jews moving into Postville, and then there's a lot of kind of cultural conflict with the native Iowans there. Okay. Postville had a visitor center that would actually give multicultural tours to people, kind of showcasing all the work that they were doing around multiculturalism. Okay, and other officials from throughout Iowa would go and do these tours. And the public schools had a bilingual curriculum. Okay? So the town was actually trying to be really accommodating to the community. So I've mentioned the Latino stores that were revitalizing downtown. This is an interesting store. This is the bakery, and the bakery kind of plays a key role in this story. So one of my key kind of interviewees was the owner of the bakery, who's become my friend, and he was one of the original 3 Guatemalan immigrants to the town. Okay, he came from Texas to Guatemala, and he became this informal Guatemalan leader, and he actually previously worked in the meatpacking plant, and he left the meatpacking plant and became a union organizer, and he put a lot of pressure on the meatpacking plant owners, and he's told me a lot of stories that I really can't get into, but it was very tense kind of organizing that was happening within the meatpacking plant in the community. So all of this within this bakery, so it's kind of a fascinating tale there. Okay, the town even protected the unauthorized immigrants because they really did see them as a resource. Okay, so this is from a Guatemalan leader. He states that 2 town representatives approached him and said, "I just want to tell you the following. You are safe here in Postville." Okay, that was the first time I had heard that. You have safety in Postville, but outside of Postville, you guys have no type of guarantee. So he's saying that we had to know that there were certain rules we had to follow. It was like they gave us permission to come, but with that permission came certain rules that they had to follow. Okay, so they had to be, the Guatemalans had to be in their best behavior. Okay, they had to be in their best behavior, and they had to kind of abide by these kind of tacit understanding that they were there to work, and they could participate in certain community events. Okay, but at the same time, that kind of gave them this veil of protection that they felt that they had. At the end of the day, that didn't really kind of hold up because it wasn't the local people that they really had to worry about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the smuggling networks that existed in these 2 communities. Okay, so arriving in Postville was easy. We had a place to live and new friends and family. I think that's one of the key things here that's really important, is that you had those social networks already in place in these communities, and those social networks led to the kind of the reinforcement of the transition of the community to a Guatemalan community. So the more stores that were present, the more connections in terms of housing, and the more connections in terms of the meatpacking plant, the more welcoming of a shadow place it would be for immigrants. So my brother paid the coyote, so the smuggler. I lived with my brother near the gas station. We lived in an apartment building that had 2 buildings, and everyone there was from Rosario. I lived with my 2 brothers, cousins, and friends. Okay, so they were all living within these kinship networks. So in the article, I described this transformation from the community relying on professional coyotes or professional smugglers. The trip will cost them about $5,000, but that $5,000 would get them into the U.S. It would get them a job in the meatpacking plant, and it would get them housing and so forth. they had in the community these formal prestadores. Okay, so prestadores means like a money, like someone that will lend you money. Okay, so they had these formal prestadores. They were even able to get money from Guatemalan banks for the trip. Okay, sometimes they had to leave some collateral to do that. But then the community started to get pretty savvy about this, because once once a few of the community members started to make the trip, they learned the best routes. They even had, they created what I call community coyotes. So these were people within their own community that this kind of became a business for them as well. That they were then able to go through Mexico, and they knew how to get into the U.S. and so forth. So it actually created a pretty safe system that transformed the community. So from 2003 to 2005, the Guatemalan community grew from 50 to 500 people. So these informal prestadores were from the community, and like I mentioned, a lot of the smuggling actually occurred through these churches. So the way this would work is, people would go to church on a Sunday and just informally make contacts with the coyotes, and really it was just other community members, right? But that understood how the system worked and so forth. So they would make connections in that way to get to the U.S. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the sending communities and the receiving communities, and I'm not going to get into too much of the issues around the sending communities. I have another article that gets into that and the reasons why the Guatemalans had to leave in the first place. Okay, but these communities are they're about Rosario is about an hour drive from Antigua, Guatemala. So if you've been to Antigua, it's up in the highlands of Guatemala, still in the state of Zacatepecas. Okay, and the workers used to work at a flower plantation where they grew roses. Okay, and then that flower plantation kind of dried up, and it actually went out of business. So the people were dislocated from those lands, and they began their informal communities in just outside of the finca. Okay, and they basically they lived off the land, and these kinds of conditions. Once one immigrant worker kind of got into Postville, and then that kind of led the whole chain reaction to that. In the transformation, I'll talk a little bit later about the transformation of the communities in Guatemala. So the whole system was working pretty well. Okay? The Postville immigrants were kind of benefiting from it financially. They were sending money back to their communities. The Postville community was benefiting from it, but then the immigration rate hit. Okay? And the immigration rate hit in 2008, and this pretty much overnight made the whole system come tumbling down. Okay. So the raid, I won't get into the specifics of the raid, but if you know anything about Postville, you can follow up on that. But some of the impacts, the raid severed these transnational flows overnight. The meatpacking plant filed for bankruptcy. The community had financed a wastewater treatment plant for the meatpacking plant, so they were indebted to them. Postville lost a lot of their population. The housing market collapsed as well because of this. The niche businesses that were catering to the Guatemalan community, they all kind of dried up as well. The mayor actually tried to declare it a humanitarian disaster to get some money from the government, but that didn't really pan out. The remittances, actually, I calculated they were sending almost $50,000 back a month to Guatemala, okay, and that all dried up as well. So the last thing I was going to talk about are the remittance networks. Okay, so with remittances, there's a whole body of literature related to remittances, so I really didn't follow up on that, but I think it is part of the story here. Okay, the remittances basically help the Rosario residents build housing, build community centers. The local government, this bridge actually was built with remittance money as well. So the community started to do public works projects. They got some money from the government in Guatemala, who also kind of chipped in into that. So there was a lot of growth in terms of the local economy, and even people that were sending money back hired other people in El Rosario to do, to do some of the building of their houses, to do some of the agricultural work and so forth. So it created all these like kind of spin-offs and so forth in the local community. Because this is some of the, show you some photographs of some of the upgrading that occurred in the community. Like the bridge I mentioned. This is a school that used to be have only 2 rooms. Now they built it into a 8-story type of school with a park. All this was done with remittance money. Okay, so the remittances were having a huge impact in El Rosario. Now, once those links were severed, those flows kind of stopped. So the housing kind of stayed still. The immigrants were really embedded, and with the money that they had borrowed, all their stores on there also shrunk, and all the urban upgrading that was happening in the community stopped as well. This was one of my friends down there that I met. He told me his story a few times. He was deported twice when he came to the U.S. Once he got caught up in the raid. He had just been working at the raid in the meatpacking plant for about 15 minutes when the raid hit. Yeah, so it's really, it's just unfortunate. But there's a lot of these kinds of stories that I can't get into right now. But there's that aspect of it. Okay, so if we go back to my kind of framework that I'm developing here. So I think now you kind of understand how all these things play themselves out. Okay, so you have all these networks that exist. So recruitment networks, the smuggling networks, the lending networks, the remittance networks, and all these kind of create this shadow kind of structure that exists in this community. Okay, and again, I think this shadow structure exists in a lot of different communities. And now there are more Guatemalans back in Postville, but they're actually coming from different communities. So this picture was taken in a community on the border of Guatemala and Mexico that I was going to start following the Transnational links again, but I decided not to pursue that. But now the networks have changed. And I think that's one lesson here, is that these networks are really dynamic. So these networks existed in Postville during this particular time, but today they might be very different. And so it's this really fascinating kind of thing. So in conclusion, I'll leave you with this, kind of the key things that I learned in the Postville research. It's really you gain a better understanding of how unauthorized immigrants use informal mechanisms and networks within shadow places, and it's really how they use them as agency, okay, as a way to improve their lives. Okay, and they have a lot of power in how they use this. I'd like to expose the state's role in regulating shadow places via creating illegality and encouraging informality. Okay, so the state plays a key role in this type of criminality. Okay, they create the vulnerabilities that maintain these populations in a subordinate position. Okay, and they leave the risks mostly within the immigrant workers. Okay, they facilitate and maintain the exploitative and vulnerable labor force. And then the state doesn't really have to take ownership of providing the social mechanisms for that population because they're criminalized. There's a system that promotes unauthorized migration. The former Secretary of Labor, Ray Marshall, he talks about something, he views them as kind of co-conspirators, so the employers, the state, and immigrants. I would say that the immigrants, and many times they're kind of forced to be a part of this system because of the lack of opportunities and the push that they get out of their communities in Guatemala. And these are just some of the publications that I've had around Postville, where I focus on different aspects of Postville. So I focus on the conditions in descending communities. I focus on immigrant integration models that are limited within this shadow context. And there's this other element here that I didn't get into, but there's this gendered aspect to this as well. A lot of the immigrants that were not deported but were put under house arrest were women, and they were put in GPS kind of bracelets. And so that's another aspect of this. But yeah, I want to thank you for for your time, and I'll take the questions.
Quick question about, well, it's kind of a question, kind of a comment. I think that I'm glad that you're sort of working with the illegality literature, because I think it's definitely revolutionized the way, at least in the US, that we think about immigration. But I was just going to say that I think part of what your fieldwork brings to the illegality literature, because of the sort of smaller scale of Postville, is that, so part of the illegality literature says, okay, there's this state that's maintaining this sort of system, right? Which is something that you beautifully show in your own fieldwork. But then you have this tremendous immigration rate, right? And a huge part of this population gets deported. And as you say, these ties are severed, right? And this is something that the illegality literature doesn't really consider, right? They talk about sort of deportability and the threat of deportation as a way to sort of maintain this shadow economy, right? But what you're showing is how, you have this tremendous deportation, these ties are severed. So then how does that benefit the system, I guess, right? It almost like, I don't know, I mean, I guess you can make the argument that it sort of wipes the slate clean to create sort of a new system with a different population, right? Getting people to come from not El Rosario, but like some other place, right? Or is it actually a contradiction in the system, right? That like by deporting such large numbers of people and creating this sort of what the mayor called an humanitarian economic disaster or whatever, is it actually like a potential contradiction in the system? And I think, I don't know, I feel like if I were you, if I explored these kinds of questions, you can make these really interesting claims about what's happening in the rest of the US, right? By having this like deportation state, is it actually going against, right, the larger sort of economic, political interests of the state?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. I would say that the raids actually are still part of maintaining the system. So these large raids were conducted under the Bush administration, and I think it was more of a showcase that they were actually trying to do something about immigration, when really I think it was just a way to like create like some drama around this and a lot of attention around it. And with the Obama administration, at least not in the last few years, but they were that administration was actually deporting a lot more people, but they were doing it in a much more kind of covert type of way. So I think to keep this structure going, I mean the state has to not that they have to pretend that they're doing something, but it's I mean people like immigration officers need jobs, right? So another way of looking at this is the state needs this population to kind of maintain this system going, but once in a while they kind of have to showcase an example, make an example of a certain place. That's kind of how I would look at it.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for a really, really interesting talk. I guess what I was wondering the whole time is that there's this constant they're taking our jobs, anti-immigration, rhetoric in certain political pockets of the U.S. But where this is located is like quintessentially that political pocket, red, state, nationalist, Tea Party, etc. And the years that you were there are, I think, during the election years where this sort of anti-immigration rhetoric is reaching a fever pitch. So I'm just wondering then how that played into, I don't know, trust and and just, I guess, racial ethnic relations in this community? Because my sense when you were telling the story is that it seemed very, I don't know, like touchy-feely, and everybody was all, happy, and like, but I don't know, it seems like maybe that's not really what was going on or something.
Right. So I didn't get into the real kind of, I guess, juicy, like, kind of labor struggles that were happening in the community. But there was a lot of that. Like, even within the meatpacking plant, there was a lot of sexual abuse in the meatpacking plant. There was a lot of labor kind of exploitation within the meatpacking plant. So I don't want to, like, not touch upon those things, because those were real and those things were happening. However, I think that the Midwesterners are, in a way, very pragmatic kind of people as well. So I think, at least in Postville, the sense of trying to be welcoming to this new labor force was a real thing. And I think that people understood that that labor force was keeping the town afloat. And I think that's kind of an important thing to acknowledge. But at the same time, Iowa does have, like, the representative from Iowa, I think his name is King. He's one of the key, like, anti-immigrant voices in the country. So, yeah.
Hello. Oh, hi. Thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.
I also have a question about the relationship between the immigrant workers and the town.
Mm-hmm.
Just wondering if you have what your thoughts are in potential, like, shadow costs to Postville, in the sense that it sounds like some of the community leaders were very strongly warned, like, be on good behavior while you're here. Do you have any reason to believe that any of them were not? Because I know that my sense is that in shadow communities, there's also high risk of shadow behavior. So I don't know what that would mean, but just curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good question. So honestly, I didn't dig deeply into those issues, but I think that informality and kind of the shadow places do have this connection to other forms of criminality. Okay, in Postville, I get the sense that there wasn't a lot of that going on. In my research in Iowa, I'm actually seeing that there is more of that tie. But in Postville, I didn't really see that.
Hi, I wanted to ask you something about the sending community, El Rosario in Guatemala. Do you see the push factors, the lack of jobs or the violence reducing, and maybe some opportunities opening up in Guatemala like they have in Mexico, which will reduce the number of people seeking jobs in the United States?
So, do you mean like the change? I guess I'm a little confused.
It seems, well, what I heard in Mexico now, there's like essentially a balance where the number of people returning from Mexico are about the same as the number coming to the United States. For the first time, there's zero net migration. Partly the recession in this country, partly the recession and the raids and the repression, and partly growth in the Mexican economy that is providing jobs for people. So I was just wondering, Guatemala is a much poorer country in comparison to Mexico, but whether you're seeing some of this growth taking place that will reduce.
Well, what I did see in El Rosario was that and then even now that the communities are actually starting to migrate again, like the investments that people were making into their communities, that actually created like some opportunities for economic development in the area. So that increased more jobs and so forth. But the violence in Guatemala, I would say it's in terms of like the kind of criminal elements are still pretty prevalent. So I think that's still kind of pushing a lot of these immigrants to make the journey.
I'm wondering if there might be a really cool story about the dynamics here. You're kind of implying it in your talk about the people from El Rosario coming later in this process, that plant had been there for some time.
Mm-hmm.
So there must have been another group of workers. And is there sort of a competition in these
Mm-hmm.
plants is kind of small? Is there a, kind of a real competition among people that were there before
Yeah.
and the people that are replacing them?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely a competition, and the meatpacking kind of owners play on those differences, like on the ethnic differences and what people are willing to kind of sacrifice to get to the area and do the work. So another interesting aspect of this is that once the raid hit, the meatpacking plant actually remained open for a while, and they looked for workers, like refugee workers they brought in, I think, Somalis from Minneapolis to do some of the work in the plant. But the owners weren't really satisfied with the kind of work that they were doing. Then they also brought in people from Texas, but these were more of like I don't know, kind of marginalized kind of people from Texas, and they weren't happy with that work. So I think there is this dynamic of competition that's kind of based on different kind of on the different racialization that happens in the plant. Okay.
I was interested to hear about what the community in Postville thinks about things now, and other people are having expressed that. So I'm interested to hear what Rosario thinks about America, and about Iowa, and about the way that they were immigrating before, and how they approach that now. And also, if a lot of the people that were in Postville were deported, I assume some went back to Rosario. I wonder what their status in the community is now.
Yeah. So I should say that the last time I was in Rosario was 2 years ago. And within those 2 years, probably a lot of changes could have occurred within those 2 years. But when I was there, people were still feeling like the kind of the dreadful consequences of that raid. Okay? So a lot of people were still out of work, and actually this was kind of an unusual raid because people were arrested and then detained for federal immigration fraud. So that means that, and they actually, most of them were found guilty and deported within a few days. But that means that they're not allowed to come. If they do come back to the U.S. and they're caught again, they would get like a 25-year sentence. So really, this raid disrupted those networks in a very profound way that I think maybe in other deportations that doesn't happen. So maybe people get deported and then they come back and there's more of a back and forth. But I think in Rosario that was very different. Yeah, I think that's. Yes. Mm-hmm.
How planners deal with a shadow transnationalism that's really out of the shadows in their specific location. Ultimately, they have to deal with issues that are land use, zoning, housing, social provisions perhaps, and also in transportation. And it seems like you mentioned something in terms like diversity champions. Or is there also a contradiction in intention to the actual work that they carry?
Yeah. So this is a good planning question because the difficulty I had with this research was trying to always relate it to planning. Planners are not used to dealing with this. So I'll tell you how the reaction happened in two different communities. So in Rosario, it was pretty much in the open that all these remittances were coming back. And then in Guatemala, they're called aldeas, which are basically the municipalities that in Rosario was an aldea, but they belong to a municipality, okay? And so once the remittances started coming back into the community, the mayor of the municipality would send an architect and a planner to help them, build these community projects and so forth. So that was very much in the open. So in Rosario, though, that's a lot more interesting because the planners there, they, the city had codes in terms of how many people were allowed to live in housing and so forth. So they basically ignored those, and they ignored those on purpose because they knew that this was a really important type of labor force that they needed there. Some of the community leaders, like even from the schools, like they weren't necessarily planners, but the school leadership was very much, in a way, kind of turning a blind eye on this whole shadow aspect as well. They were giving opportunities for students to work in the meatpacking plant and so forth, in a way as you get job training and so forth. But then once everything came down, then that led to a lot of problems. So I think it's an interesting tension there that exists, like because the planners are supposed to regulate the space, right? But the whole point of the shadow, relationships is that they're supposed to be below that regulation. So I think the role of the planner was really to turn a blind eye.
Yes, thank you for a wonderful talk. I am curious because you said that the community in here, the Guatemalan, they have their method of contain good behavior, and that is very interesting because what kind of good behavior is avoiding that they becoming drug, or is preventing them to say something about the exploitation going on or the abuse? What is that?
Yeah, so I think it happened in many in those aspects, but I'll give you an example from an everyday example that one of my interviewees said. So he said that when the Guatemalans would go down to the laundromat, and usually they would kind of wait until the laundry machines were empty until they would go ahead and wash their clothes and so forth, because they wanted to kind of not make call attention to themselves. But once the Guatemalan community started getting more comfortable in Postville, once they started establishing their businesses and they felt like they had more of a ownership of the community, he gave me this example of the Guatemalans started to, like, if someone finished doing their laundry but they didn't take their clothes out, they started taking out their clothes, and that would create more tension in the community. And I think that's a really good example of like the everyday type of assertion that a community starts establishing once they feel like they have more of an ownership in the community, but that kind of led to some tensions in the area. That's like a real simple everyday example, but you can go from that all the way to like not complaining about sexual abuse in the meatpacking plant.
That perhaps this is all one. I don't know if this makes it. Okay, good. This one system that's all very logical and is all working, that they really want to benefit from this system of exploiting workers, etc. But is it not really possible that within the country you have truly people who have just competing views on the issue? Like, I guess I'm concerned about this attempt to apply one story to something and make it a very functional system, when in reality it might not be the case. Because particularly I noticed in Berkeley, and a lot of people within the academy that study immigration, illegality is such a word that's so scoffed at, like, oh, illegality. But in some parts of the country, it is an issue. To them, it's, I don't understand why it is not illegal. Like, it's rarely explained. It's just scoffed, and we're like, oh, of course, illegal is. But it's not really explained, so that perhaps these are really competing narratives and people disagree and they don't all have the same view of this system and how it benefits the country.
Yeah, so I appreciate the comment, and I think in many ways this depends on the context. So actually where I want to take this research is, now that I'm in Oregon, I want to study the Pinedo population, which are the forest workers. And I think in a context like in Oregon, where you have this really racialized kind of climate there, and you have the Pinedos that are basically replanting the trees in Oregon, but they're mostly undocumented and so forth. I have a hunch that this type of narrative actually might be very conducive to understanding the situation in that environment. I think a lot of the transnational and the shadow relationships that exist within the meatpacking, I think this explains a lot of what's going on in the meatpacking industry. I think you can understand these communities, even the Pinedo communities, like in Oregon, using this type of framework. But maybe when you get into more urban environments, maybe it gets more complicated. Thanks. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, well, I think it was both. Like, I didn't. It was a lot of investment actually was like private investment into their homes, and even investment in some of the agricultural kind of industry there, and people hired like the people that didn't immigrate. They hired them to work on their lands and so forth. But like I said, that kind of created some animosity as well within the sending communities. In terms of the community aspects, this community had a lot of needs, so they decided to invest in education and in health, like a health clinic. So they got together. They didn't organize a formal hometown association. So a lot of the transnational literature focuses on hometown association. Here it was like, most of Postville was a hometown association, right? So they kind of did it informally through all these evangelical churches.
I noticed that in the graph that shows the enrollment of students,
Mm-hmm.
of Latino students in the school system, the year 2008 was when it dropped.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also the year where we basically admitted that we were in a recession.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but link those two kind of important moments, but also that in the role that the state plays to perpetuate the system that we actually benefit from, I think that it's also kind of an important thing to point out that there was huge anti-immigrant sentiment
Mm-hmm.
at that time as well, and that anti-immigrant sentiment also kind of rallies people to feel more American, even though the system that they are a part of is actually, not being true to them, democratic values being, homes being lost, etc. But we can all rally around, being anti-immigrant
Mm-hmm.
during those times. So that's just something that it's more of a comment, but that's definitely something that I noticed.
Okay, great, thank you. Mm.
I see nothing of interest when you tell me to the state.
Mm.
I mean, the state is actually a governing body that's supposed to regulate the law.
Mm-hmm.
And people are coming illegally.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that what ICE did was in the interest of a state legitimacy, not necessarily, detention. The only people who benefit is not the state. The only people who benefited were the people who ran basically a system that exploited workers,
Mm-hmm.
a town that exploited housing, and a community that exploited them getting here.
Mm-hmm.
Not the state. I don't know. The state itself has interest
Mm-hmm.
of legitimacy in enforcing the law. And if they're coming illegally, then the only way that I understand the state would have interest is to do this each and every time
Mm-hmm.
that they find.
Yeah, but I think my argument there was that the state creates the conditions of illegality that then all these other players can take advantage of.
So the state doesn't do this. I mean, the government does this. The state just acts on whatever the laws that a government passes.
Mm-hmm.
The state is the apparatus that actually enforces
Mhm.
And I just don't see any, I see that them not doing something in each and every one of these cases as undermining their legitimacy rather than the other way around.
Yeah. So I guess as an urban planner, I look at the state as in different scales. So the federal government has a state, the state as that's where the where the planners can intervene. So when this criminalization happens, I think it happens at the federal level, and then the different notions of what you're calling the government. They benefit from that intervention in different ways.